The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University. This is EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy. Now, here's your host, Dr. Dan Sutter.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. America's market economy is extraordinarily efficient, delivering thousands of different goods and services to people across the country. Normally, we never have to worry about stores being out of the things we want or need. And if they are, shelves are quickly resupplied. Yet since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen shortages of numerous items, beginning with toilet paper and hand sanitizer, and now we have shortages of cars and furniture and other items on months-long back orders. The prices of many things that are still available are rising, with inflation at its highest level in decades. And since the summer of 2021, a small armada of freighters have been waiting off the coast of California to dock at the ports in Los Angeles. Many politicians and experts claim now that America's supply chains are broken and the government needs to step in to oversee this mess. December 2021 marks the 30th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union. Is America's economy now destined to resemble that of the former Soviet Union, with empty store shelves and people lined up for blocks for goods whenever something appeared? Joining me on EconVersations today to help make sense of our current shortage economy and transportation traffic jams is Peter Earle. He's an economist with the American Institute for Economic Research. Mr. Earle studied engineering at the U.S. Military Academy and has earned graduate degrees in economics and finance. And he worked in finance for 20 years before joining AIER. Welcome back to the show, Pete.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get started here by let's talk a little bit about what we know about both the shortages and some of the price spikes and now the transportation backlog. So you've written about all these things for AIER. So tell us about some of the details of what's going on here.
So it really all starts, and this is a point I find myself making regularly, is people are attributing many of the problems we see today to a virus. That's only to a very, very small extent the case. Most of the problems we're seeing today started with the government response to the crisis, which is to say lockdowns, stay-at-home orders, things like maximum capacity, owing to social distancing, maximum capacities in workplaces, and then some other effects, such as the massive both fiscal and monetary policy response to the pandemic. But the virus didn't do any of that. Now, you could say initially there was something of a demand shock when people originally began hearing about COVID and they got worried about it. Some people did stay home. They opted to work from home. They didn't buy as much, but that was very short-lived. What you had developing more in later March and April of 2020 was that with 300 million people staying home, 300 million Americans out of say 340, I believe, million Americans were under some form of lockdown or stay-at-home order. Nobody was working, but you had this tremendous supply shock, positive. So that was fed by the first stimulus payments, and that's how this all began.
So, because initially, for a very short time, the savings rate jumped to all-time record levels, but then quickly people started spending. But a part of the story is not just that they started spending, but they were buying some different things than they had been before. And that's a really important part of this story. Changing spending patterns are going to have real impacts on the economy, right?
Right. So what you have is you have many, many people at home. And so some examples of the things that they purchased. I mean, first of all, of course, ordering food became huge, but also things like electronics. A lot of people wanted to play, say, video games, that sort of thing, or they decided to buy a console. Exercise equipment was a particularly popular area of consumption because people didn't want to go outside, or their gyms were closed, or they just sort of made resolutions to be more healthy in the wake of this, of what was real, at one point, a health crisis, essentially. And also a lot of DIY, do-it-yourself projects. There are a lot of orders for hardware, for lumber, and that sort of thing. Because with time on their hands, a lot of Americans said, this is the time that I can, fix the banister or build that shelf or whatever it is I need to do around the house.
And lumber was one of the areas where we saw like completely unprecedented price increases for lumber. This is completely unlike anything. There's normally a pretty sleepy market, and then so lumber prices went crazy as you've documented, right?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned in the opening, I spent 20 years as a trader, and the lumber pits, lumber trading was always extremely sleepy. I mean, in the pits, and generally the types of firms and the types of participants in the lumber market are almost completely commercial, right? So you might have like Home Depot and some home builders in there, but very few speculators, that sort of thing. Maybe some timber companies, but when you had mills shut down in April and May, and no one buying anything, lumber, which is priced in, so the price units are 1,000 board feet. So lumber went from 400 per 1,000 board feet down to like 260, 270 per 1,000 board feet. That was the initial people staying away from the Home Depots and the Lowe's and that sort of thing. And then within the next 6 to 8 months, 8 to 10 months, lumber's price went from $300 per 1,000 board feet to over $1,700, which is a record. It's an all-time record, and that's on the heels of an explosion of do-it-yourself projects, mortgage applications leading to more home building, and all that fed by people being at home and also being sort of led to consume by receiving stimulus payments. And I think one of my favorite anecdotes from that time period is that we went from a market, the lumber futures market, which was very sleepy and quiet. It sort of traded between $200 and $500 dollars per 1,000 board feet for decades, to a point where the action was so hot in the pits and in electronic trading that a cryptocurrency exchange actually opened their own lumber trading facility to accommodate the overflow of volume, which is, I mean, it's incredible to consider.
And then we've seen other changes in buying patterns. And you talk about things like people wanting to buy exercise equipment or consumer electronics, as opposed to like entertainment or dining out at restaurants. Well, those things they're wanting to buy are going to be generally imported as well, or at least assembled in the United States, with a lot of things that have to get imported to the United States for assembly. And that's going to have impacts on our transportation system, right?
Sure. I mean, with the gaming consoles and with the smart TVs and the exercise equipment, all of those generally are manufactured abroad. But there's two things. There's the transportation component, and there's also the electronics component. They almost all use semiconductor chips, and we had a huge semiconductor shortage that's now still affecting cars and trucks. And of course, we've had tons and tons of goods in our highly globalized economy that have been had to be transported here. And that is one of the reasons why we have this tremendous. There's a number of factors, but that's one of the reasons why we have this tremendous sort of informal commercial flotilla off of so many ports today, is that the imports have been just coming in an avalanche.
Yeah, to meet the demand, not just as the components of demand shifted, that's going to shift to other things. And right. Whether it be hand sanitizer or gaming consoles or exercise equipment, there's a reality about production, and like we talk about in economics that production takes time and it involves capital goods, and so there are what we call capacity constraints in every industry out there in the economy. Talk to us a little bit about this.
Yeah. So in order to expand capacity, you need to invest in capital. There need to be either more factories or more raw materials brought into play and all this stuff. This is the very furthest part of the term structure of production. It also means more time to produce things. So you can't just, so what we can't do is we can't just sort of whip up, a multiplicative or exponential increase or whatever it is, whatever the mathematical rule is in production overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, but one of the reasons why we enjoy the low cost for goods and the rapid availability of goods is because companies have been very good at just-in-time processing or just-in-time production, which means they don't make things and then let them sit in a warehouse or on a shelf for a while. They make things sort of as orders come in. And the benefit of that is that the benefit of that sort of system is that it allows for lower prices and more responsiveness, and companies can put more effort into making those processes more efficient, becoming more productive. But the downside is that when there's a huge, and I mean, a lot of this is based on statistics, when there's a second or third or whatever it is, standard deviation increase in orders, it means they very easily get behind. And it's not easy to ramp up those processes and to increase that productive capacity. The other thing is that initially, many firms, even with that sort of rush of orders and that sort of high demand, they're not going to do that because they don't know if it's going to last.
Right.
They can't see the future. Their economic calculations it tends to be pretty good, but they don't know if this is a 1 or 2 day blip or a 1 month blip or a permanent sort of paradigm shift. So it's very difficult for them to keep on top of it with so much uncertainty and with the cost associated with expanding their productive capacity being so high.
And the same thing that we say about capacity constraints, not only does it affect the production of computers or exercise equipment, they also exist in the transportation sector. I mean, there's only so many freighters, there's only so many berths at ports, and again, those things can't be created, nobody can wave a magic wand and make new ones appear overnight, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole cocktail of issues with regard to ports. The first is that U.S. ports, because they're dominated by collective bargaining agreements, they're not the same as ports you might find in China or in Denmark or places like that. Our ports tend to run from, I believe, 5 a.m. to about 9 p.m. And many of the unions have been successful in sort of keeping away some of the labor-saving technologies that are employed elsewhere. It's also the fact, as we mentioned before in other situations, in the other context, that ports are extremely capital intensive. It costs a lot of money to upgrade all those cranes and things like that. In some cases, they would need to dredge certain ports and make them deeper, which is, I mean, that's years. That's a project that could take years to do. And also the other parts. I mean, containers, for example. Containers, I didn't know this, of course, before I started doing research, but containers they're a seemingly very simple undertaking, really just a large corrugated steel or aluminum box. But it's a wonder of the modern economy because they are made today to go from ship to truck to rail to barge, and for that reason they're standardized and they allow for companies to plan capacity and to plan how much they can ship. But the other thing is that they are very much, I'm not going to say controlled, but there's only a handful of firms that dominate that market. So there are sort of some quasi oligopic sort of forces there, and generally speaking, those firms tend to produce them at a rate roughly equal to the amount at which the global population of containers retire. But in this case, we have not just had, but have even as we do this show, we've had untold containers waiting on ships, waiting at ports, and so a lot of firms that are shipping things have actually opted not to offload things as quickly as they might have because possession is 9/10 of the law. They're worried that if they pull stuff out too early, that container might be picked up by another firm. So the list of sort of domino effects from lockdowns a year and a half ago is we're on the maybe fourth or fifth order effects now.
Yeah, and it's important to know that, I mean, these are real economic challenges. I mean, to try to increase production, to try to increase transportation of goods in a short period of time is a real challenge. And like there are things that are real challenges, and those are unavoidable. And then there are some things like we do to shoot ourselves in the foot, which maybe we could avoid. But there are some serious challenges here with the capacity constraints. And as you've mentioned about not knowing if a increase in demand is going to be permanent, there's also an issue when you choose how much capacity to have. I think you used in one of your articles this thing. You don't build a church based on the attendance you're going to have on Easter and Christmas. You have to take into account not
Right.
just the record levels, but you're really taking into account how much what attendance is going to be on a normal day, right?
Right, right, and that's why I use the example. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but my guess would be that in the operations management or industrial engineering, they probably say, we'll take the most the most voluminous Christmas or whatever we've ever had, and add like 1.5% or something like that, or 1.5 times. But all of those sort of constraints, which are again how they, I think of them as that's the way that we are allowed or able to afford lower prices, is by that sort of real streamlining of efficiency. But all of these numbers in so many ways, in terms of ship capacity, in terms of offloading capacity, in terms of the number of containers, in terms of the pallets that go into the containers, have all been blown out of the water.
Yeah.
So the good news is that the price system works.
Right.
The bad news is that oftentimes governments or regulators try to arrest it or try to mitigate it, which is the worst thing that could happen, but it's a frequent response.
But when we have this challenge and people want more of a good than can possibly be produced, at least in the near term, they're going to have one of two things happen. Either the economics tells us either the price has to go up or there are going to be shortages. People who are not
Right.
going to be able to buy what they want to have, and that's sort of what we're experiencing now. And it's this response is something unavoidable in a way, right?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so there's going to be rationing when these types of things happen. The question is, do you want rationing by the decentralized price system that brings together information from all over the place, including most importantly local information, or do you want rationing by fiat, by command? And I mentioned before what happened in lumber, but when lumber hit almost $1,700 per thousand board feet, you had a predictable reaction. Now, nobody can tell what price this will happen, but the price turned out to be at about $1,700 per board feet, where people who were bidding on projects, people who were starting projects, withdrew from the market. At the same time, or roughly that time, you had all of a sudden old furniture stores start breaking apart furniture because the profit margins were way too good to pass up. So they said, no, I could sell this couch or this chair a year from, or these hundreds of chairs, probably much more volume, a year from now, or I could capture these high profit margins. And the combination of people withdrawing from the market and also more supply flowing into the market at those high prices. I mean, we had lumber suddenly fell from 1,700 down to about 300 in about 6 months, and now it's about at the price it was before the pandemic, but it went from an absolutely manic surge to basically a crash. But that's a good crash. I mean, that's supply and demand coming back into line. That's bringing lumber out of the woodwork, so to speak. And
Right.
people who were bidding up saying, this is making the project I was going to do unprofitable. When home builders began building clauses into home building contracts saying you may have to add an extra $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 if to the price of a house if lumber keeps going up, that immediately affected demand.
Mm-hmm. And when the prices of used shipping containers double, I mean, one of the things it does is that anybody who has a shipping container, owns a shipping container out there, wherever it is in the world, has an incentive to say, maybe I can sell it, maybe I can, in effect, give it so it can help, bring some more goods to the U.S.
Sure. There's many shipping containers, and that's something that was discovered throughout the summer and fall of this year. There's many shipping containers out there which are holding supplies, or they're pushed together in the back of someone's lot, and they're still serviceable. And many of those are being emptied out and being brought to bear to help in the shipping imbroglio. So yeah, I mean, at a high enough price, things start materializing all over the place.
Right.
Maybe not enough, but it helps.
And one thing to on top of all of these stresses sort of from increases in demand, we've had a few things happen in the global shipping industry in this past year to disrupt things, beginning with incidents in the Suez Canal, right?
Yeah. So what's interesting to me, and what I find curious about this is that any one of the things that have happened individually would not be a big deal.
Right.
But starting with lockdowns, everything that happened was not just additive. It was, as I used the term before, multiplicative. It made things 10 times worse. You have lockdowns, right? And then you have the Ever Given get stuck in the Suez Canal, and that backed up a few hundred ships. And then you had closures at ports like Yantian and Ningbo in China, which pushed things back even further. And then, of course, as containers and pallets start to disappear and that sort of thing, and then pallets, and then, of course, the labor shortage, you have containers not being loaded onto trucks quickly enough and reduced space, and then a host of other factors, along with consumers still have a lot of money. I mean, we're still at record. We're still at nearly record levels on savings. So there's a lot of consumptive capacity out there, a lot of discretionary cash out there, so to speak. So, I mean, all of these things have led to a huge backup, and it's not just that; it's other areas too. But it started really with the lockdowns. The lockdowns are sort of predicated or based upon a philosophy, implicit, but I think very real, that the economy, or that economies could happen nationwide, worldwide. The economies are like light switches, and you can turn them off and turn them back on at will. And I think one of the great takeaways, one of the things that I think people should take away from this is that we are lulled, we as human beings, not just Americans, but certainly Americans, the rest of the world, are lulled into complacency by the reliability and responsiveness of the modern economy. You know, I can order something today and it will literally be at my house tomorrow. And that makes the economy seem like this massive, intricate machine. But in fact, it's a very delicate and precarious sort of dance, which is very easily upended. That's my other point, is that any one of these things, whether it's the drought in Taiwan that made it harder or that slowed down chip production because it's a very water intensive process, or whether the closure of Ningbo, which occurred, the Chinese port, which occurred because one person, a 34-year-old, tested positive for the coronavirus and was even asymptomatic. Any one of those things would have been a hiccup. But on top of the lockdowns of last year, and then each other, they became tremendous bottlenecks, which it will take some time to get out from under.
Oh, politicians often like to at least pretend that they can solve all of society's problems, and some people have not just politicians, but many experts have been making calls that some of the federal government presumably we should get more involved in managing our broken supply chains. And toward this end, President Biden appointed a port envoy, sometimes called a port czar, back in August. And some people are saying we need a supply chain czar as well. In trying to unpack this, I think there's a first thing to say is are our supply chains really broken in this case, or are they doing the best? Are they doing a good job?
Yeah, so I would first say supply chains aren't broken, but they were broken. Someone broke them, and it was the political response to so many to the virus and that sort of thing. And it's also monetary policy, where you have lots of money chasing capital intensive processes and raw materials and goods, and you have fiscal stimulus. There's a whole bunch of things that fed into this, but virtually all of them come from government policy. And about this port czar, the one thing I'd want to add is I know that there's two things that have been done, two major things that have been done by the Biden administration so far. One is to fine ships that are waiting to offload off coasts and ports, $100 per container, which can be like $1.2 million a day for the large Panamax shippers, which it's hard for me to understand how finding them $1 million a day makes things move along any quicker. And first of all, it seems to be punishing them for the effects of government policy. The second thing is the Biden administration has said that they reached an agreement at several major ports, those that tend to be off the coast of California in particular, to expand working hours. But there's a reason why ports were only open from 9 to 5. It's because through collective bargaining, many of those port workers make $150,000 to $180,000 a year in overtime, which could be time and a half, will make the prices skyrocket even more. Mm-hmm. So between sort of parasitically leeching off of the situation they created via fines on waiting vessels off the coast, and between helping out their collective bargaining pals, all they've done is help themselves. They've only made the costs associated with the bottlenecks vastly higher, mm-hmm. which will eventually be passed on to consumers too, by the way.
But I mean, I believe the statistics show that the ports this year are going to handle more goods than last year. So I mean, it's not like we have shortages because all of a sudden nothing's coming through the ports. The things that are broken down. We have shortages because we're exceeding the capacity that we have here. But
so the bigger first half of the year.
I think a bigger question about the government trying to get involved and manage supply chains is just how incredibly complex these are. And you had a great story in one of the pieces you've written about this, about how it is that the lumber shortage is affecting ocean shipping now. And I think that was a great, explain that for us, because it's a great indication of just how complicated and how complex these things are.
Sure. So something I didn't know when I wrote the timber article is that one of the major uses of timber is in pallets. And pallets go into, there's many goods that you can't just put into a shipping container. You need pallets on the bottom between to make that 2 to 5 or 3 to 5 inch space between the bottom of the shipping container and the and whatever's being shipped. So when the lumber crisis, or when the lumber prices began to rise because of shortages, there were that many less pallets. So at one point, even if you had shipping containers, you might not have the pallets to put in there. But what's great about it is that although wood is, for reasons which I'm sure I don't fully understand, superior, one can use plastic pallets. By the way, there's a plastic shortage too. But plastic pallets have been used in some cases. And also, in many cases, private industry has risen to the challenge. Amazon just last year, and sort of it was a very uncanny sort of hunch they may have had, or just pure luck. They purchased a fleet of planes to transport goods. Changes the economics of shipping, but at least it allows stuff to get where it is. Walmart and Home Depot and a bunch of other firms have actually chartered ships. Some of them have chartered large ships. Some have chartered smaller ships to get things into smaller and more shallow ports. So the resourcefulness of private industry has come to fore and is addressing a lot of this in ways that the federal government probably wouldn't or couldn't come to. But yeah, I mean, there's so many facets to it that are basically impossible to anticipate.
And that complexity is just going to overwhelm it, especially if one person or one government agency is supposed to be overseeing all of these incredibly complex supply chains. I think they would easily get overwhelmed. And I think one of the scary things to my mind about more government oversight of supply chains is the government oversight usually also requires government approval for changes, because once you get a plan in place, the worst thing that's going to happen is somebody deviating from that plan without permission. And you've mentioned some of these adjustments that firms are making, like Home Depot and Walmart chartering ships, and I just wonder how long it would take for a government bureaucrat to agree, okay, you can go ahead and charter a ship to try to alleviate these shortages.
Yep. More time, more costs, all that.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for coming on and explaining some of these events for us, and showing how they're all related and all part of a fundamental economic challenge that we face. And thank you all for joining us. Join us next time for another EconVersations.
This has been EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University.